presentation. And now we move forward with our next speaker, who is NaYeon Kim, who is a PhD student at Princeton and in the lab of Dr. Sabine Kastner. And today she will present her research on searching for a neuromarker of spatial attention bias in school-aged children. We are also very happy to know that NaYeon Kim now enjoys yoga, apart from research, even though she didn't enjoy that in the past. Anyway, thank you very much, NaYeon. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so everyone can see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. Today I will share my work on the neuromarker of spatial attention bias in school children. I'll give you a horizontal line and ask you to point to the middle. You won't be perfectly accurate unless you're a computer. Interestingly, there's consistency in those subtle errors that you make, and this indicates a bias in your spatial attention. Spatial bias measured in line bisection is closely related to dorsal fronto-parietal network or dorsal attention network. In this network, areas in each hemisphere generate attentional signals towards the contralateral side, right hemisphere to the left-hand side and left hemisphere to the right-hand side. And these two processes are balanced through mutual inhibition. For this horizontal line, I indicated the actual midpoint for you. If you have a stronger right hemisphere, you will have a slight leftward bias and say red is the middle. If you have a stronger left hemisphere, then you will have a rightward bias and say blue is the middle. By calculating how much the subjective midpoint deviates from the actual midpoint, we can find a single value of spatial bias for each subject. In our measure of spatial bias, 0 means no bias, negative values mean leftward biases, and positive values mean rightward biases. In healthy adults, spatial biases overall were normally distributed around 0 with some individual variability. We recently found that young children are biased towards the left-hand side of space. The leftward biases in children gradually diminished with age and became adult-like by age 11 to 13. This raises a question whether greater attention biases in children indicate a developmental mechanism of the attention network. To address the question, we began by searching for a neuromarker of spatial biases in children. As in adults, we expected that spatial biases will be related to connectivity among the frontal-parietal areas, specifically frontal eye fields in the frontal lobe, and areas along the intraparietal sulcus and superior parietal lobule in the parietal lobe. We collected both functional MRI data while children watch a short movie clip and their spatial biases outside the scanner. In our final sample, children showed leftward biases as a group, which replicates our large-scale behavioral study. Can we build a model that can predict each child's spatial bias from their functional connectivity profiles? To do so, we first identified frontal and parietal areas in each hemisphere using a probabilistic atlas. Then we selected pairs that were significantly correlated with behavior, either positively correlated or negatively correlated. Because positive spatial biases indicate more rightward biases and negative more leftward, positive network pairs were stronger connections in rightward biases and negative network pairs were stronger in leftward biases. These are the pairs that we found to be correlated with behavior. In the positive network, the hub was found in the left parietal lobe and its connections within the left hemisphere and some interhemispheric connections were included. In the negative network, the hub was in the right frontal lobe and its connections with the right and left parietal areas, as well as some interhemispheric connections were included. Interestingly, we found different hubs for right and leftward biases, which could indicate different control centers for interhemispheric interactions across fronto-parietal areas. So these edges were correlated with behavior, but are they able to predict spatial biases? We use the connectome-based predictive modeling to build a linear model that can predict behavior from the sum of connectivity strengths of these selected edges. And the answer was yes. The predictive model based on functional connectivity within these areas successfully predicted spatial biases. We used two different cross-validation schemes to assess the model's performance, and they both indicated significant prediction. And we also found that prediction of spatial bias was specific to dorsal attention network, which included the areas that we saw in the previous slide, but not other fronto-parietal networks. So we were able to find a connectivity-based model to predict spatial biases in children exclusively from the dorsal fronto-parietal attention network. Next, we plan to apply the current model to external data sets and see whether we can find age-related or ADHD-related differences in predicted spatial biases. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, NaYeon. It was a great presentation. I didn't know about this bias, so I was very surprised. And so we already have one question for you,
Okay.
which is how Mert is asking how measure the spatial attention bias in behavior.
Okay, thank you. I didn't have much time to go over this task in much detail, so thank you for asking that question. So traditionally, this line bisection task was actually it asked subjects to actually manually mark the midpoint of a horizontal line. That was widely used in neurological studies to detect hemispatial neglect, for example. But we realized that when we use such manual task, it will have various confounding variables. For example, motor confound for children, or especially children with neurodevelopmental disorders. They sometimes have motor deficits or their motor functions are still developing. So in order to avoid that motor confound, we use the perceptual version of it. So we instead showed a series of pre-bisected horizontal lines and then asked the participant to indicate whether left side or right side is shorter than the other. And by manipulating the bisecting vertical line following a staircase procedure, we were able to draw a psychometric curve, and that way we can estimate the spatial bias for each subject.
Awesome. I was wondering, like, why did you choose to use like functional connectivity, especially because we are talking about children here? I was wondering if there is any structural pattern in the brain that is also identifying like this bias. Maybe we are one of the.
Yeah, that's definitely our future. Thanks for asking. That's definitely our future direction. So we have their movie viewing data and DTI, but we have some white matter tracks. So we are planning to look into those properties really in relation to this spatial bias measures. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking that, even the sulcal depth measures that people nowadays started to look at in the frontal lobe in relation to the working memory performance. I think that could also be really interesting to look into in the parietal lobe and then see whether that kind of structural measures also can predict spatial biases. But this is a starting point.
How variable is this spatial bias amongst like children of the same age? Like when you're saying like the left hemisphere is stronger in children of age 6, let's say, are there also individual variabilities? So some children maybe report like a right bias.
Yes, I'm showing you the individual data on the dots. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is definitely variability within age group. And we found that the variability was slightly larger in younger children as well. So there is definitely individual variability within age group, and we think there should be some variability in developmental trajectories. So longitudinal studies could shed light on that in the future. But within the same individual, it's surprisingly very consistent.
Okay. Interesting. Do you have any other questions? I could ask many questions again, but just wondering if the other speakers, okay, we just got another question from Mert. Could this bias be explained from a developmental point of view? We know that even though left hemisphere is stronger for language for many people, the right hemisphere seems to be stronger for a while during certain ages of childhood. Could we somehow say that right hemisphere develops more than left hemisphere during development?
Interesting. So I think we had like a similar question when we started looking into this neural data. Currently, we can't really talk much about the age-related difference in the current data set. That's why I'm planning to, I wanted to build a predictive model and apply to a larger database with more subjects. I think when we saw this behavioral data first, we thought about reading development actually. So in these children, this is the start of elementary school. So these children start learning to read, and we have a data that we have in this paper, but not in this slide. That we are looking at these age 6 to 8 or grades, first graders to third graders who show more pronounced leftward biases. And we also measure their reading fluency using a rapid automatized naming test. And then we saw that both measures were related in a way that leftward biases predicted better reading fluency. So that could be one piece of evidence that may point to the relationship between these spatial biases and reading. And it could be that spatial biases appear as children learn to read from left to right in English language. And then as they become more fluent later on, these spatial attention becomes better balanced. But that's still a hypothesis, and we are collaborating with the Hebrew-speaking institution, and then see whether Hebrew-speaking children will show the opposite spatial biases.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think if we have no further questions, we can move to the next speaker. But if you have further questions for NaYeon, just ask them like on the chat. So thank you again for the great presentation. And our next speaker is going to be